Picture this. Millions of people around the world have gotten emotional hearing about the circle of life. They've sung along to Elton John's masterpiece, watched baby Simba being lifted up on Pride Rock, and felt that warm Disney magic wash over them. It's beautiful. It's natural. It's perfect. But what if I told you that this beloved philosophy is actually one of the most sophisticated propaganda systems ever created? What if the circle of life isn't about harmony at all, but about convincing the oppressed that their suffering is not just necessary, but sacred? Let's start with what we're actually seeing in that iconic opening sequence. All the animals of the Pride Lands gather to bow down to a newborn lion cub. Zebras, elephants, giraffes, they all travel vast distances to witness this ceremony. But why? What makes this particular baby so special that entire species must pay homage? The movie tells us it's because of the circle of life, this mystical natural order where everyone has their place. But look closer at what that place actually means. The lions sit at the top of Pride Rock, literally above everyone else, while the zebras and antelopes gather below. And here's the kicker. Those same zebras and antelopes that are bowing today will be tomorrow's lunch. Think about the absurdity of that for a moment. Imagine if cows had to attend ceremonies honoring the farmer's son, knowing full well they'd end up as hamburgers. Would we call that a beautiful natural cycle, or would we recognize it for what it really is? A system designed to make victims complicit in their own exploitation. The circle of life philosophy presents predation not as survival, but as some kind of spiritual arrangement. When Mufasa explains it to young Simba, he doesn't say, "We hunt because we need to eat." He says, "When we perish, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass, and so we are all connected in the great circle of life." It's poetic. It's profound. It's also complete nonsense. This explanation serves one purpose: to make the brutal reality of the food chain seem mystical and inevitable. By framing predation as part of a sacred cycle, it removes any moral questions about the system itself. The antelopes aren't victims. They're participants. They're not being exploited. They're fulfilling their cosmic purpose. But notice what Mufasa conveniently leaves out of his explanation. He talks about lions becoming grass that feeds antelopes, but he never mentions the far more common reality: living antelopes becoming food for living lions. The actual daily mechanics of this beautiful circle are glossed over in favor of poetic metaphors about grass and spiritual connections. This is Propaganda 101. Take an uncomfortable truth and wrap it in beautiful language until people stop questioning it. The circle of life doesn't describe nature, it romanticizes oppression, and it gets worse when you examine who's spreading this message. Mufasa isn't just any lion, he's the king. He benefits directly from this system. Of course, he wants everyone to believe that the current arrangement is natural and sacred. What ruler wouldn't want their subjects to think that questioning the hierarchy is questioning the very fabric of existence? The genius of the circle of life lie is that it makes resistance seem not just futile, but spiritually wrong. If this is how nature intended things, then fighting against it isn't just rebellion. It's blasphemy against the natural order itself. Look at how this plays out in the movie. When the hyenas complain about being exiled to the elephant graveyard while lions feast in the Pride Lands, they're not presented as having legitimate grievances about inequality. They're portrayed as villains who don't understand their place in the sacred order. Their hunger isn't a sign of systemic injustice. It's evidence of their moral corruption. The movie even gives us a perfect example of what happens when someone buys into this ideology completely. Remember the presentation ceremony? All those animals traveling to bow before a baby who will grow up to hunt them. They're not just accepting their fate, they're celebrating it. They're literally worshiping their future predator. This is the most disturbing aspect of the circle of life philosophy. It doesn't just justify oppression, it makes the oppressed grateful for it. It transforms victims into willing participants, convincing them that their suffering serves a higher purpose. The ceremony on Pride Rock isn't a celebration of life. It's a coronation of a future predator, blessed by the very creatures who will feed him. It's a religious ritual designed to sanctify an inherently unjust system. And that's exactly what makes it so insidious. The circle of life doesn't look like propaganda because it's wrapped in spiritual language and beautiful imagery. It doesn't feel like manipulation because it appeals to our desire to see meaning and purpose in natural processes. But strip away the mystical language and orchestral music, and what you're left with is a simple message. The strong should rule, the weak should serve, and everyone should be grateful for the arrangement because it's natural. This isn't wisdom, it's indoctrination, and it's about to get much darker as we examine the religious machinery that keeps the system running. Now that we've established how the circle of life functions as propaganda, let's examine the religious machinery that makes it so effective. Because every successful cult needs three things: a divine ideology, sacred rituals, and most importantly, a spiritual leader who can claim direct access to higher powers. Meet Rafiki, the Pride Land's resident shaman, mystic, and quite possibly the most effective cult leader in Disney history. Think about Rafiki's role in the system. He's not just a wise old mandrill offering advice. He's the sole intermediary between the living world and the great kings of the past. He alone can interpret the signs. He alone can commune with the spirits. He alone decides what the ancestors want and when they're speaking. This is classic religious manipulation. By positioning himself as the only conduit of divine wisdom, Rafiki makes himself indispensable to the power structure. The kings may rule the Pride Lands, but Rafiki controls their connection to legitimacy itself. Watch how this plays out in practice. When Simba is lost and broken in the jungle, who appears to guide him back to his destiny? Rafiki. When the Pride Lands need a sign that their rightful king has returned, who provides the mystical confirmation? Rafiki. When the system needs spiritual validation, Rafiki is always there to supply it. But here's the crucial question. What happens if Rafiki decides a ruler isn't legitimate? What if he claims the ancestors disapprove? The system has no backup plan because it's designed to be dependent on his spiritual authority. This isn't wisdom. It's a monopoly on divine interpretation. And like all monopolies, it serves those who control it. Look at the physical staging of Rafiki's ceremonies. Pride Rock itself isn't just a convenient elevated platform. It's a temple designed to reinforce hierarchy. The lions stand at the peak, closest to the sky and the great kings of the past. Everyone else literally looks up to them, both physically and spiritually. The presentation ceremony we discussed earlier isn't just political theater. It's a religious coronation disguised as a celebration. Rafiki anoints the future king with sacred symbols, raises him toward the heavens, and the assembled masses don't just witness, they worship. Notice how the entire spectacle is choreographed to inspire awe, not questions. The dramatic music, the elevated platform, the mystical elements. It's all designed to overwhelm rational thought with emotional response. Who's going to question divine will when they're caught up in such a transcendent moment? But the most insidious element of this religious system is the concept of the great kings of the past. These aren't just ancestors, they're deified former rulers whose supposed wisdom justifies current policies. When Mufasa needs to convince Simba of something, he doesn't rely on logic or evidence. He appeals to the eternal wisdom of dead kings. This creates a perfect closed loop of authority. The current king rules because the previous kings approve, and we know the previous kings approve because the current king says so. It's circular logic disguised as spiritual truth. Even more cleverly, this system makes it nearly impossible to challenge royal decisions without appearing to disrespect the ancestors themselves. Criticize Mufasa's policies, and you're not just questioning a ruler. You're insulting the sacred memory of every king who came before him. Watch how Mufasa uses this religious framework to control young Simba. When Simba asks challenging questions or shows independence, Mufasa doesn't engage with the actual issues. Instead, he redirects to spiritual platitudes about the circle of life and the wisdom of their predecessors. This is indoctrination masquerading as education. Simba isn't being taught to think critically about leadership or ethics. He's being programmed to accept that some truths are beyond question because they come from a higher source. The genius of this approach is that it makes rebellion feel not just politically dangerous, but spiritually wrong. How can you fight against something that's been blessed by generations of sacred ancestors? How can you question a system that's been ordained by the stars themselves? And notice how conveniently these divine messages always seem to support the status quo. The great kings never appear to suggest radical changes or to challenge the fundamental structure of Pride Land society. Their wisdom always seems to align perfectly with maintaining current power arrangements. This isn't coincidence. It's by design. Religious authority works best when it validates existing hierarchies rather than threatening them. Rafiki and the royal family have a symbiotic relationship. He provides spiritual legitimacy for their rule, and they provide social status and protection for his position as spiritual leader. But here's what makes this system truly diabolical. It doesn't just control the rulers, it controls the ruled. Every animal in the Pride Lands has been taught that their social position isn't just natural, it's sacred. Challenging the hierarchy isn't just rebellion against the king, it's rebellion against cosmic order itself. The zebras don't just accept being prey because they're physically weaker than lions. They accept it because they've been convinced that this arrangement has divine approval. Their suffering isn't meaningless. It's their sacred contribution to the eternal cycle. This is how religious manipulation works. It transforms victims into believers. Instead of seeing themselves as oppressed, they see themselves as spiritually fulfilled. Instead of questioning why they must suffer, they find meaning in their suffering. The Pride Lands aren't just a kingdom. They're a theocracy where divine right and natural law have been merged into an unquestionable ideology. And like all effective theocracies, it doesn't maintain control through force alone, but through the much more powerful tool of genuine belief. But religious authority is only one pillar of this system. The real genius lies in how these spiritual beliefs are used to justify a rigid social hierarchy where everyone knows their place and never questions why that place happens to benefit some while exploiting others. Now that we understand the religious machinery behind the circle of life, let's examine what this sacred natural order actually creates. A rigid caste system that would make ancient India blush. Because here's what Disney doesn't want you to notice. The Pride Lands aren't a harmonious ecosystem where everyone lives in balance. They're a stratified society where your species determines your social class, your economic opportunities, and even your right to exist. At the top, we have the lions, the noble ruling class who live on Pride Rock, literally above everyone else. They don't hunt for themselves. They don't build their own shelters. They don't even raise their own children without help. Their entire existence is subsidized by the labor and lives of other species. Then we have the service class, creatures like Zazu who've been granted proximity to power in exchange for absolute loyalty. Notice how Zazu isn't just Mufasa's advisor. He's his property. The Hornbill doesn't have opinions, aspirations, or independence. His entire identity revolves around serving the royal family. This is what scholars call house slave mentality, where the oppressed become so invested in the system that oppresses them that they defend it more fiercely than their oppressors do. Zazu doesn't just serve the lions, he genuinely believes their superiority is natural and deserved. Watch how he reacts when anyone questions royal authority. When Scar makes legitimate points about Mufasa's failures as a king, Zazu doesn't engage with the actual issues. Instead, he appeals to protocol and tradition. The system isn't wrong, questioning the system is wrong. Below the service class, we find the truly insidious level, the free herbivores who think they're participants in the circle of life, but are actually just livestock with better marketing. The zebras, antelopes, and gazelles aren't citizens of the Pride Lands. They're a renewable resource that happens to move around on its own. Here's the brilliant psychological trick. These animals are convinced they have agency and purpose. They're not victims being farmed. They're contributing to the circle. Their deaths aren't tragedy. They're fulfillment of cosmic destiny. But notice how one-sided this contribution actually is. When do we ever see lions sacrificing themselves for the good of zebras? When does Mufasa volunteer to become grass so the antelopes can eat? The circle of life somehow always seems to require the same species to give and the same species to take. This isn't balance, it's exploitation with spiritual branding. And then at the very bottom of this hierarchy, we have the untouchables, the hyenas. These are the creatures who've been completely exiled from the sacred order, forced to live in the wasteland of the elephant graveyard, while the lions feast in paradise. The official story is that hyenas are naturally evil, chaotic creatures who don't understand the circle of life. But look at what they actually want: food, territory, and basic respect. Their complaints aren't about destroying the natural order, they're about being excluded from it. When Shenzi says, "Yeah, be prepared," we'll be prepared for what? And Banzai responds, "For the reign of Queen Shenzi, They're not plotting cosmic destruction. They're planning to overthrow a system that has systematically marginalized them. But here's the genius of the circle of life propaganda. It frames any challenge to the hierarchy as an attack on nature itself. The hyenas aren't rebelling against an unjust social system. They're violating sacred law. Their hunger isn't evidence of systemic inequality. It's proof of their moral corruption. This is scapegoating one-on-one. Take the most desperate victims of your system and convince everyone else that these victims are the real threat. The hyenas become a convenient explanation for everything wrong in the Pride Lands. Drought? Hyenas disrupted the balance. Conflict? Hyenas are naturally chaotic. Social unrest? Hyenas are corrupting the natural order. It's the same logic used by every oppressive system throughout history. The problem isn't inequality, it's the people who complain about inequality. Think about the geography of this arrangement. The lions get the lush, fertile pride lands with abundant water and prey. The hyenas get the elephant graveyard, a literal wasteland where nothing grows and the only food source is rotting carrion. And everyone pretends this distribution of resources is natural rather than political. The movie even shows us what happens when the excluded finally get access to better territory. Under Scar's rule, the hyenas move into the Pride Lands and suddenly the area becomes barren and lifeless. But this isn't because hyenas are inherently destructive. It's because the system was never designed to support everyone equally. The Pride Lands were artificially abundant because they were subsidized by the exile of hungry competitors. Remove that exile, and the true carrying capacity of the land becomes apparent. The paradise was only sustainable because it excluded those who needed it most. But the most telling aspect of this caste system is how it programs each level to police the others. The service class like Zazu doesn't just serve the nobility, they actively suppress rebellion from below. The herbivores don't just accept predation, they participate in ceremonies celebrating their own future consumption. Everyone becomes invested in maintaining the hierarchy because they've been convinced their position, however low, is both natural and sacred. The zebras may be prey, but at least they're not hyenas. The hornbills may be servants, but at least they're not zebras. This is how caste systems maintain themselves. Not through force alone, but through convincing everyone that their current position is the best they could possibly achieve, given the natural order of things. Everyone has their place isn't wisdom, it's a threat disguised as comfort. It means stay where you are, want what you have, and never question why some places are better than others. The circle of life doesn't create harmony. It creates a stable hierarchy where inequality is not just accepted, but celebrated as cosmic. Truth. But how does this system maintain itself across generations? How do the lions ensure that each new generation of prey animals will willingly participate in their own exploitation? The answer lies in the most insidious aspect of this cult: the systematic programming of young minds. The most chilling aspect of any cult isn't how it controls adults. It's how it shapes children before they develop the capacity to question what they're being taught. And the Circle of Life system has perfected this psychological programming to an art form. Let's examine Simba's education, because what Mufasa calls teaching his son to be king is actually a masterclass in ideological indoctrination. From the moment Simba can walk, he's taken on morning patrols where Mufasa shows him the kingdom. But notice what these lessons actually teach. Simba doesn't learn about ecology, animal behavior, or even practical leadership skills. Instead, he learns to see the Pride Lands through the lens of ownership and dominance. Everything the light touches is our kingdom, Mufasa tells him, not this is where different animals live, or this ecosystem supports many species. The very first lesson is about possession. This belongs to us, and by extension, everything in it exists for our benefit. When young Simba asks, "What about that shadowy place?" showing natural curiosity about the forbidden elephant graveyard, he's not given information. He's given a command. You must never go there. No explanation of why. No discussion of the complex issues that led to the hyena's exile. Just absolute prohibition backed by paternal authority. This is Indoctrination 101. Replace curiosity with obedience. Don't explain the world. Just establish which parts of it are forbidden and make questioning those boundaries unthinkable. But the real psychological manipulation happens when Simba inevitably disobeys and visits the elephant graveyard. Any normal educational approach would treat this as a learning opportunity. You discovered something important about the complexity of our society, or let's discuss why some animals are forced to live in wastelands. Instead, the incident is framed as evidence of Simba's moral failing. He didn't uncover uncomfortable truths about systemic inequality. He disobeyed his father and put himself in danger. The focus shifts from the content of what he discovered to the act of discovery itself. This is how authoritarian systems maintain themselves, by making investigation feel like betrayal. Simba learns that seeking answers to forbidden questions doesn't lead to knowledge. It leads to shame, disappointment, and punishment. Even more insidiously, the consequences of his curiosity are blamed on him personally, rather than on the system that created the conditions he discovered. The hyena's anger and desperation aren't treated as symptoms of injustice. They're evidence of why curiosity about forbidden topics is dangerous. The message becomes clear. Stay within approved boundaries, accept approved explanations, and never dig deeper into uncomfortable realities. This isn't education. It's the systematic destruction of critical thinking. But the circle of life system's most sophisticated psychological weapon isn't punishment. It's what happens to those who completely break free from the programming and then get pulled back in. Enter Timon and Pumbaa and their philosophy of Hakuna Matata. On the surface, this seems like a healthy alternative to the oppressive royal ideology. No worries sounds liberating compared to the weight of inherited responsibility and sacred duty. But look closer at what Hakuna Matata actually represents. Timon and Pumbaa aren't free spirits who rejected the system. They're broken products of it. A meerkat and warthog living together isn't natural cooperation. It's two outcasts who've found each other in mutual desperation. They've been so damaged by their exclusion from mainstream Prideland society that they've created a coping mechanism based on emotional numbness. Hakuna Matata isn't wisdom. It's dissociation. It's what happens when individuals are so traumatized by systemic rejection that they convince themselves caring about anything is pointless. Notice how their lifestyle works. They eat bugs, live in isolation, and avoid all meaningful relationships or responsibilities. This isn't freedom. It's depression disguised as philosophy. And here's the really sinister part. When the system needs Simba back, it uses Timon and Pumbaa's broken state as a cautionary tale. Look what happens to those who truly reject their responsibilities. They become isolated, purposeless creatures who contribute nothing to society. The message is clear. You can rebel against the circle of life, but you'll end up like these pathetic outcasts who've given up on everything meaningful. This is sophisticated psychological manipulation. The system allows certain forms of rebellion, but only the self-destructive kinds that ultimately reinforce why the original system is necessary. Simba's time with Timon and Pumbaa isn't presented as a valid alternative lifestyle. It's presented as a temporary escape that ultimately proves unsatisfying. When Nala finds him, she doesn't encounter an enlightened prince who's discovered better ways to live. She finds a traumatized exile who's been using emotional numbness to avoid dealing with reality. The contrast is stark. Stay within the system and have purpose, meaning, and connections, or rebel and end up isolated, directionless, and ultimately empty. But the most powerful programming tool in the Circle of Life arsenal is guilt, specifically the weaponization of inherited trauma and responsibility. When Simba finally returns to the Pride Lands, he doesn't come back because he's been convinced the system is just. He comes back because he's been convinced that his absence caused suffering. The drought, the destruction, the starvation, all of this is presented as the consequence of his failure to fulfill his ordained role. This is psychological manipulation at its most refined. Simba isn't choosing to be king because he believes in the righteousness of monarchy. He's accepting the crown because he's been convinced that rejecting it makes him responsible for everyone else's pain. The system doesn't need Simba to love it. It just needs him to feel so guilty about the consequences of abandoning it that resistance becomes emotionally impossible. Notice how this programming works across generations. Mufasa was raised with the same guilt, the same sense of inherited responsibility, the same conviction that personal desires must be sacrificed for the greater good of maintaining cosmic order. Each generation passes these psychological chains to the next, not through force, but through love. Parents who genuinely believe they're preparing their children for important responsibilities while actually programming them to never question the fundamental assumptions underlying those responsibilities. The circle of life doesn't survive because it's true. It survives because it's psychologically inescapable once you've been properly conditioned to believe in it. And here's the truly disturbing part. This isn't just an ancient fairy tale about talking animals. These same psychological techniques are being used right now, in the real world, to convince real people that current arrangements of power and inequality are natural, inevitable, and morally necessary. If you think the circle of life philosophy is just harmless entertainment from a children's movie, let me ask you this. When was the last time you heard someone justify inequality by calling it natural? When was the last time you heard a CEO explain massive wealth gaps by saying, everyone has their role to play? When did you last encounter the argument that challenging existing power structures would disrupt the natural order? The circle of life isn't ancient history. It's the modern world's most successful ideological export. We're not just watching a movie about talking animals. We're witnessing a blueprint for how contemporary systems of control operate. Think about how modern capitalism presents itself. Not as a human-created economic system with winners and losers, but as a natural force that rewards merit and punishes laziness. The wealthy aren't beneficiaries of systemic advantages. They're alpha predators who've earned their position through natural superiority. Sound familiar? It's the same logic Mufasa uses to justify why lions rule while zebras get eaten. The strong naturally rise to the top, the weak naturally serve or perish, and questioning this arrangement isn't just economic heresy, it's a violation of natural law itself. Corporate culture has fully embraced circle of life thinking. Companies don't exploit workers, they provide opportunities for people to find their place in the economic ecosystem. Employees aren't being underpaid, they're learning to start at the bottom before they earn advancement. Mass layoffs aren't human tragedies. They're natural market corrections that maintain healthy business cycles. Even the language mirrors Mufasa's spiritual rhetoric. We don't have brutal competition. We have creative destruction. We don't have exploitation. We have market efficiency. We don't have systemic inequality. We have natural hierarchies based on talent and effort. The genius is identical. Take an inherently brutal system and wrap it in language that makes resistance feel not just futile, but morally wrong. Just as the hyenas became villains for wanting food and territory, modern critics of inequality become jealous, entitled, or threats to prosperity. And who's our modern Rafiki? Who's the spiritual leader convincing millions of people that these arrangements are not just inevitable, but beautiful? Disney itself. Think about it. Disney has spent nearly a century creating narratives that program children to accept hierarchy as natural and questioning authority as dangerous. The Lion King isn't an aberration in their catalog. It's the culmination of decades of ideological conditioning. Look at the princess movies through this lens. Cinderella doesn't organize the other servants to demand better working conditions. She waits for magical intervention to elevate her individually. Snow White doesn't question why she's expected to do unpaid domestic labor for 7 men. She finds fulfillment in service. Belle doesn't challenge the feudal system that allows beasts to imprison people. She falls in love with her captor. The pattern is consistent. Individual salvation through acceptance of existing hierarchies, never collective action to challenge unjust systems. Even the progressive modern Disney films follow the same template. Mulan saves China by working within military hierarchy, not by questioning why wars happen. Elsa learns to control her powers responsibly rather than using them to restructure Arendelle's monarchy. Moana restores the natural order rather than imagining better alternatives. The message is always the same. The system isn't the problem, your relationship to the system is the problem. Don't change the world. Change yourself to better fit the world as it exists. This is why the circle of life philosophy is so seductive to those in power. It doesn't just justify their position, it makes that justification feel profound and beautiful. Inequality isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature that maintains cosmic balance. Politicians love circle of life rhetoric because it transforms policy debates into spiritual discussions. Tax cuts for the wealthy aren't economic policy. They're allowing natural leaders to fulfill their destiny. Social programs aren't investments in human welfare. They're unnatural interventions that disrupt the sacred order. Even environmental destruction gets the circle of life treatment. Climate change isn't the result of specific corporate decisions. It's just humanity finding its place in natural cycles. Species extinction isn't ecological catastrophe. It's the circle completing itself as intended. The philosophy provides a ready-made excuse for every form of suffering and inequality. It's all part of the plan. It all serves a purpose, and trying to change it would only make things worse. But here's what makes this ideology particularly insidious in the modern era. It doesn't just convince the powerful that their dominance is justified, it convinces the powerless that their powerlessness is meaningful. Just like the zebras celebrating their future predator, modern workers are encouraged to find fulfillment in jobs that barely pay living wages because they're contributing to something bigger than themselves. Students are told to accept crushing debt because they're investing in their future. Citizens are asked to accept surveillance and control because it maintains security and order. The circle of life has taught us to find spiritual meaning in our own exploitation, and when people do rebel against these arrangements, they're not treated as rational actors responding to unjust conditions. They're treated like the hyenas, naturally chaotic forces that threaten the harmony everyone else enjoys. Protesters become outside agitators. Whistleblowers become traitors. Critics become divisive elements who don't understand how good they have it compared to the chaos that would result from change. The system has become so sophisticated that it doesn't need to suppress dissent through force. It suppresses it through psychology. It's convinced most people that their suffering is either temporary, if they work hard enough, or meaningful, if they accept their role in the larger plan. But here's the thing about circles. They're closed loops that always return to the same point. They don't actually go anywhere. The circle of life isn't about growth, progress, or genuine balance. It's about maintaining stasis while creating the illusion of movement and meaning. It's about convincing people that the way things are is the way things must be, forever and ever, world without end. The real circle isn't the poetic cycle of life and renewal that Elton John sang about. The real circle is the endless repetition of the same power structures, the same justifications, the same acceptance of unnecessary suffering as cosmic necessity. But what if we refuse to complete the circle? What if we decided that natural doesn't mean inevitable, and inevitable doesn't mean just? What if we stopped teaching our children that their worth is determined by where they happen to land in someone else's hierarchy? What if we started asking why some people get to be lions while others are condemned to be prey? What if we broke the circle entirely and built something better? The choice is ours. We can keep bowing to baby predators on Pride Rock, convinced that our submission serves some higher purpose. Or we can recognize that the most unnatural thing of all is accepting that inequality, suffering, and exploitation are natural. The circle of life is a beautiful lie. But the truth is even more beautiful. We don't have to live in anyone else's circle. We can create our own shapes, our own stories, our own systems, where everyone gets to be the protagonist of their own life rather than a supporting character in someone else's kingdom. The great kings of the past aren't watching from the stars, judging whether we're fulfilling our cosmic roles. There is no cosmic role. There is no predetermined place. There is only what we build together and what we're willing to accept. So the next time someone tells you that inequality is natural, that hierarchy is inevitable, that questioning the current arrangement would only make things worse, remember the zebras bowing to Simba. Remember what they believed. Remember what it cost them. And then decide, are you going to complete their circle or are you going to break it?